Friends, we invite you to join us in our new series of lectures, which will be on higher cognitive processes. These will include decision making, thinking, problem solving, and language. Can we imagine a human world without language? The expression of all psychological processes, cognitive as well as affective, is done through language. Many hidden aspects of our mental functioning are actually known only because we as human beings are capable of expressing them through language. In addition, as is always said, language provides the vehicle of human communication, and as such, it is instrumental in bringing people together, in cementing relationships, but also in breaking up relationships. So, the power of language should never ever be underestimated. Perception, learning, and memory are very fundamental cognitive processes, and emotions are known as affective processes. All other psychological processes are initiated by and rest on these fundamental processes. Emotions do have the possibility of expression through the face and other parts of the body. That is, at least in the case of emotions, there is a chance that people can see them from outside, as the phrase is used. Yet, subjective emotional experience cannot be necessarily observed from outside. By themselves, perception, learning, and memory cannot be observed from outside and have to be inferred on some basis. In the case of human beings, the basis adopted most commonly for inferring the presence of these cognitive processes and also of inner affective experience is language. Many believe that language is a special feature given by nature to the human species. This idea has been debated. Do animals also use language in some form? At the moment, we are not going to get involved in this debate or controversy, but some support has in fact been given to the idea that language is not specific only to human beings, albeit we do agree that the nature of language use, if at all possible in animal species, is of a different kind. Regardless of which side of the debate we support, it is obvious that this marvelous facility called language that human beings are endowed with has many social and psychological functions. Apart from being the medium of communication, that is, the exchange of ideas between human beings, language serves as the basis of the fundamental cognitive processes mentioned earlier and also several other processes. In the present series of lectures, we will introduce the rudimentary ideas pertaining to cognitive processes that function at a level higher than the basic processes already mentioned, namely perception, learning, and memory. Such processes carry the adjective higher not because these are qualitatively superior, but more because they exhibit greater complexity. What is more important is that they subsume the fundamental cognitive processes. Several processes may be listed under the rubric higher cognitive processes, such as decision making, thinking, problem solving, reasoning, and so on. All forms of intellectual functioning or expressions of cognitive abilities also qualify to be called higher cognitive processes. The present exposition focuses on three higher cognitive processes, namely decision making, thinking, and problem solving. To these, we will add a discussion of language, its acquisition and use, as an example of another complex process. We may begin our discussion with a few general observations. All cognitive processes involve thinking in some form. In that sense, thinking as a process need not be isolated from other cognitive processes. What is being thought usually gets expressed, described, or narrated through language. To that extent, language too appears to be a common element in all cognitive processes. With regard to decision making and problem solving, many problem solving and puzzle solving situations contain a component of decision making, although this may not always be true. Likewise, many decision making situations, especially the ones that pose a dilemma, may also become problems that require a solution. In fact, many analysts of decision making do build into their theories or models an element of problem solving. It has to be understood that although there may be overlapping or common elements between the processes mentioned here, all of them deserve analysis and discussion even as separate processes and mechanisms. We begin with a discussion of decision making. Let us look at some of the quotations that are popular in this context. Truly successful decision making relies on a balance between deliberate and instinctive thinking. So says Malcolm Gladwell in 2005. Yet another little poem is in front of us here. This goes something as follows. Whenever you are called on to make up your mind and you are hampered by not having any, the simplest way to solve the dilemma you'll find is simply by flipping a penny. Piet Hein has actually drawn attention to some common elements and features that we experience in everyday decision making of various kinds. To look at what Malcolm Gladwell is saying once again, what is being highlighted is that there is an element of intentional or what he calls deliberate thinking in decision making, but we cannot ignore an instinctive or unlearned, unconscious or effortless component as well. In Piet Hein's little rhyme, the last line is particularly meaningful because it brings to light the fact that many times we are left with no option other than to flip a penny. In some quarters, this has been referred to humorously as flippism. That is, when we do not have any other alternative, we make decisions by chance or simply by tossing a coin. Let us see what psychologists and other specialists have to say about this process called decision making. We begin by pointing out something that is probably a cliche, a common experience, and that is that decision making is a part of being human, regardless of age, gender, intelligence, the resources we have, and the circumstances we are placed in. All human beings at some stage or other, at some point in life, are in a sense forced to make decisions of various kinds. But what is this process called decision making? So here we go through one definition, another point of view, and then a general statement about what this process depicts. Robert Harris says, decision making is the study of identifying and choosing alternatives based on the values and preferences of the decision maker. In one sense, Harris's statement sums up what could be called rational economic decision making. Herbert Simon, another expert in the area of decision making, simplifies the answer by saying that decision making involves making rational choices. As we will see a little later on, Simon's view of decision making and his view also of rational choices has to be qualified in a particular way. Third, we have this general description. It need not be called a strict definition, and yet it describes what is the major component of decision making. What this process involves is considering alternatives in a situation, choosing one, and accordingly making a judgment or plan of action. Numerous examples of decision making may be given, and these may range from trivial or mundane decisions such as which ice cream should I choose when I go to an ice cream parlor, or which dress should I wear to this particular event, to decisions with greater consequences such as which career should I choose, becoming a doctor or becoming a lawyer, or whom should I marry. The presence of alternatives, that is more than one alternative, is absolutely needed for decision making. Unless there is more than one alternative, the question of making a decision, the question of choosing, in fact, does not arise. But even when there is apparently only one alternative present in the situation, a yes or no decision may be made. In other words, with even one course of action in front of us, we would always have the choice of taking that course of action, following that course of action, or not following that course of action. Besides, decisions vary in multiple ways. Different classifications have been proposed by some scholars. We take a brief look at some of these major classifications. The first classification is between cognitive, behavioral, and ethical decisions, and correspondingly decision making with respect to these three forms of decisions. The first one, cognitive decisions or judgments, involve the following. The individual has to consider alternatives. No particular action may be planned or required in that situation, but cognitively speaking, the individual has to make a decision more in the form of what is called a judgment. If one looks for a synonym for the word decision making in a thesaurus, one does come across the word judgment, but here we would like to point out that one has to be a little careful in making the distinction between decision in the form of a judgment and decision in the form of an action which is usually based on some kind of judgment. Some examples of cognitive decisions or decision making can be given. For instance, we have something called the signal detection approach, and according to this approach, we can apply it to certain tasks in specific domains. For instance, a pathologist looks at the report of a test. She has now to decide whether the disease is present or not in terms of yes or no. Another example of the same kind of decision is a participant in an experiment has to listen to two sounds and decide whether the first one is louder than the second one. Once again, the response is required in yes or no format. Please note that in both of these examples, the person who is making the judgment or cognitive decision really does not have to take action or to even suggest an action. Instead, only a particular decision in terms of a judgment is required, which is why it is described as a cognitive decision. But we look at the second form of decisions, namely behavioral decisions, and find that there is a difference. In such decisions, After considering alternatives, the individual has to make a plan of action that can actually be executed or implemented. Judgments do precede the action, hopefully, but it is the action that finally matters. We have all heard the proverb, "Look before you leap." In behavioral decisions, the observable or measurable aspect is the leap itself, but unless the person has looked before the leap has been taken, that is, unless the decision maker has made a judgment before the action was implemented, chances are quite high that the decision will contain at least a few problems. Here is an example of a behavioral decision which we come across very commonly. A student who has just completed his school education has now to decide whether he wishes to become a doctor, an engineer, or a lawyer. He may have to consider the marks he has got, the expenses involved in the education he will go through depending on which of these professions he chooses, and the job prospects in each of these careers. But finally, he will have to decide on a particular course of action. In other words, he cannot simply sit down with a judgment he has made and not translate it into action. The third kind of decisions in the first category or classification may be called ethical decisions. Strictly speaking, the word ethical here refers to the domain or the content and the nature of decision, rather than whether it is cognitive only in nature or includes a behavioral component. Ethical decisions involve what is more popularly known as moral judgment. That is, we decide whether specific alternatives are morally right or wrong. Following this moral judgment, either the individual or some other person makes a behavioral decision. Sometimes, of course, only a judgment or cognitive decision is involved, and the actual implementation of whatever judgment is made is left to some others. Here is an example of a paradigm or an instance, a kind of story that is used in Kohlberg's theory of moral judgment. It is referred to as the Heinz dilemma because it is a story about a person called Heinz. Person A, that is Heinz's wife, is dying of a rare disease. A does not have the money to buy the drug that can cure his wife. So he decides to steal the drug. Which is morally or ethically more correct? Stealing the drug so that his wife can survive, or not stealing the drug and allowing the wife to die? As I'm sure most of us would agree, the answer to such questions is certainly not easy to give, and yet in many real life situations, moral decisions indeed have to be made. Let us take up another example which unfortunately may be becoming more common in our political and international life these days. Suppose a terrorist group hijacks a plane and demands that one of their kind be released from prison so that the passengers on this plane can be released in return. What does the government of that country do, from which country the passengers on the plane are actually coming from? Is it morally correct for the government to say, we are going to release this one prisoner so that we can save the lives of all those passengers who are on the hijacked plane? Or is it morally more correct to say, we will stick to our stand and we will not release this prisoner, and it does not matter if the lives of those innocent passengers are at stake? So we can see that there are several situations in which the decision is not really an everyday kind of action or practical decision or even managerial or business context decision at all. Rather, it may involve a deep-rooted moral question. A second classification can also be talked about. In this classification, a distinction is made between personal, group-related, and organizational decisions. Personal decisions are very simply those that are made by an individual and have consequences primarily for that individual. Group-related decisions are those that are made by a group, not by an individual, and these are based on discussion. Such decisions will affect other members of that group. The actual decision that is made may be taken by the group as a whole or by an individual who is deputed for that task, such as the designated group leader or the manager, and so on. The third kind of decisions, pretty well known today in the context of decision making, are organizational decisions. We do have many different kinds of organizations, and in all of them at different levels, various kinds of decisions have to be made. Such decisions which are made in the context of organizations are therefore referred to as organizational decisions. Decision-making models and theories, particularly in the context of organizational decisions, are fairly complex and need to be analyzed at a different level. We will not be looking into these details immediately. A third classification comes from Robert Harris. Harris makes a distinction between what he calls decision whether, decisions which, decisions involving contingent alternatives, and contingent decisions. Decisions whether would involve a question such as, should I or should I not buy a new car? In other words, should I indulge in this particular course of action or should I not? Decision which assumes that there is more than one alternative between which we are choosing. Which car should I buy? One can see that this goes beyond the decision of should I or should I not buy a car, and it assumes that we have already answered the whether question by saying I should buy a car. The third kind of decision in Harris's classification is called contingent alternatives decision. Here, more than one alternative is thought of. If one of them does not work, another alternative course of action is adopted. For example, I have two potential buyers of my plot of land, which of course I am willing to sell. If the first potential buyer does not pay the advance amount by the deadline, I will sell the plot to the second buyer. In other words, I have made alternative or contingent arrangements assuming certain behavior on the part of the other party. The fourth kind of decision in Harris's classification, namely contingent decisions, refers to the following. The decision is made but only in theory or in principle and will be executed or implemented only after a certain condition is met. An example is, I have bought my air ticket for a journey, but I know that I may not get leave from the authorities. Should I cancel the ticket or should I not? So my decision is, I will cancel the ticket if I do not receive the leave sanction by afternoon. Once again, there is a contingency involved in this decision, but then in a sense partly the decision has been made. I am prepared for the eventuality. A fourth classification, which is encountered more in academic settings or academic analyses of decision making, is the distinction made between rational decisions and psychological decisions. Rational decision making can be described as follows. People consider available alternatives, the value of each alternative, and the probability of getting the outcome in the case of each alternative. Putting all of this information together, they arrive at what are called rational decisions. Clearly then, if this is the process that a decision maker goes through, the decision is likely to be sound. An author named Arnaldo Oliveira writes in 2007 that rational behavior seeks to optimize the value of the outcomes, focusing on the process of choosing rather than emphasizing the selected alternative. In contrast to rational decision making, in the case of psychological decision making, people do not necessarily go through the steps that are involved in rational decision making. Instead, they may simplify the situation, go through mental shortcuts, often called heuristics, follow their own beliefs and biases, and arrive at a convenient rather than a so-called rational decision. Between the two, the rational decision-making approach involves what is called normative, that is, what people should do, whereas in the case of psychological decision-making, this refers more to what people actually do, whether it is rational or not. It is important at this point to mention that psychological decision-making cannot be described as irrational or illogical, because the logic here is very much present. It is just that it does not follow the same rules as one follows in rational decision making. Let us take a quick look at the steps involved in decision making. This is an issue that has been discussed in fairly great detail and has also been examined through research by several scholars and experts working in the area of decision making. According to Herbert Simon, one of the well-known decision-making theorists, the following 4 steps are involved in a typical decision-making situation, but this also applies to a problem-solving setting. The first step is identify the problem that requires decision-making. The second step is generate solutions to this problem, that is, in terms of alternative decisions that may be thought of. The third step, out of the solutions or decisions that have been generated, select a solution or a decision. And the fourth step is implement that solution or decision and evaluate its outcome. One might argue that actually the evaluation should take place before the implementation is done. This is not to say that such evaluation, the pre-execution stage evaluation, is not done, but what is being emphasized here is that after the solution or decision has been implemented, it is important that its effectiveness be assessed in some form or the other. Looking at a slightly more detailed analysis, we find the following steps being mentioned in decision making. The first one is understanding the situation and focusing on what decision has to be made. This is particularly important in those settings in which the decision has several dimensions and people involved in the decision making process may not be very clear about which aspect they should focus on. The second step would be collecting relevant information about all aspects of the situation or the issue. The third step, examining the possible alternatives and considering the pros and cons, that is, points in favor of each alternative and points against each alternative. And this encompasses a kind of evaluation of the alternatives in the course of decision making itself. The next step is developing further alternatives. This step is once again significant in those settings in which, after examining the first level possible alternatives, it is found that some more alternatives remain to be explored. The next step is reducing the alternatives that have been considered in the third and fourth step to what is needed, what is more practical, or what is more valuable to the problem or situation at hand. The next step is choosing one or a few alternatives out of the one that in a sense have been shortlisted for consideration, and finally implementing the alternative or alternatives. As was mentioned in the previous discussion of Simon's steps that he has described, the last step following implementation involves assessing or evaluation of the outcome. Several decision-making models and theories have been proposed, and some writers have made a distinction between three kinds of models. It would be more correct to say that most of the models or theories that have been proposed can be reclassified under these three headings, namely normative, descriptive, or prescriptive. Of course, one allows for a combination of more than one of these three kinds of models. Normative models tell us how people should make decisions. Descriptive models tell us how people actually make decisions. They are in fact a mirror of reality. And prescriptive models are those that talk about what is recommended given that we have information about what people actually do, but also what they can do. In other words, it is a combination of how people can make decisions and therefore should make decisions. One should not get the impression that all models can necessarily be fit into one or more of these kinds of models, but this classification of models and theories does serve to point out or highlight certain features that one needs to look at. There is also a distinction that is made by decision-making experts between rational models, intuitive models, and recognition-primed models. Once again, in research on decision-making, a distinction between these three kinds of models serves a good purpose. Let us cast a quick glance once again at some of the rational models, and we begin with Herbert Simon's view. As a caution, it should be pointed out that the rational model proposed by Herbert Simon actually contains an element of reality as well, and therefore it could be classified as a combination of certain normative elements with descriptive elements. First of all, Simon says that in decision making there are these three major steps or components to be kept in mind. We begin with something called intelligence, which follows after we have defined the problem or what decision has to be made. This leads to the second component called design, which involves all the steps that include finding alternatives and finding out how some of them can serve our purpose better than others, and actually working towards trying to find a solution or a final decision. This leads to the third component called choice, which actually is quite close to the last step, namely that of implementation. But before the actual implementation takes place, if we look at the core of the decision-making process, probably it is the choice component that contains the answer. Once the choice is made and the decision has been made for one particular problem or one particular situation, back again we are to the next set of decision-making actions that need to be taken. Hence, this sequence of events takes place in a circular fashion. There are some concepts that were made famous by Herbert Simon in his theory and model. One is that of bounded rationality. As the name itself suggests, the idea of bounded rationality implies that decisions by human beings are made rationally, at least in the so-called rational way, but this rationality has to be within limits. The limits on rationality are posed by some practical considerations, such as limited information regarding alternatives, limitations in cognitive processing of the available information, variations in or incomplete information about the utilities attached to the alternatives. It may be recalled that in all rational models of decision making, the utilities of each alternative that is available and the value of each alternative together form an extremely important element in defining rationality. A second concept which Simon made famous was that of satisficing. This idea is closely related to that of bounded rationality. Satisficing refers to an aspect of decision making in which the alternative being considered and possibly finalized may not be the best one, but is within acceptable limits. Usually, it is more practical, if not the most rational one in terms of expected utility. The word satisficing seems to be a combination of satisfying and sufficing, which fits in very well with the idea that Herbert Simon was trying to convey. In the case of the second set of models, called intuitive models, we find that the basic element differs from the kind of rationality that is assumed in the rational models. Intuitive decision making refers to decision making that does not seem to be based on conscious, logic-based thinking. Instead, the alternatives decided on come to the decision maker's mind rather spontaneously. In most cases, the appropriateness of an intuitive decision cannot be argued for and are frequently described, therefore, as commonsensical. One must keep in mind that intuition, in fact, in everyday affairs is quite commonly used by all human beings, but it is difficult to support or explain the idea of what that intuition is exactly all about. In fact, that is part of the definition of this idea called intuition. If we go by reasoning, we are able to provide the premises or the kind of thinking that we go through. By contrast, if we make an intuitive decision, that rationality in terms of logic or reasoning is what we find missing. So very often, people go by what is otherwise called gut feeling. So here is a problem I have, and this is the solution that I think one should follow. This kind of decision making, which does not look at any premises before or consequences after, fits in nicely with the idea of the intuitive way of making decisions. Intuitive decision making is often considered to be appropriate only because it works. That is, it has functional value and it seems to be practically useful. The third kind of models are called recognition primed models. In recognition primed decision making, there is familiarity with certain forms of decision making situations. Based on this information from prior experience, the decision maker has in mind some quick solutions or alternatives. In other words, these alternatives have not been thought up intuitively. Rather, they are based on prior experience. As and when the new situation comes up, these primed solutions or decisions are implemented. Primed, why? Because the decision maker is, in a sense, consciously or subconsciously ready for the situation as well as the decision that should follow that situation. Experts have described three variations of recognition primed decision making. First, the characteristics of the situation are known beforehand and the alternative actions, that is solutions or decisions, are also known. So, if and when the situation comes up, then corresponding action can be taken. This if-then relationship therefore follows rather smoothly because there is familiarity both with the problem and the decision that should go with that problem. The second kind of RPD or recognition prime decision making involves the following. There is uncertainty regarding the features of the situation, but the alternative actions or solutions are known in case the situational information becomes available. So, there could be contexts in which if the person has been familiar with a variety of situations that may be encountered, the person is also ready with certain decisions or solutions. But in that particular context, the decision maker really does not know if that particular situation containing those specific features is actually going to be encountered. The third kind of RPD consists of the following. Situational information is available, but information about the alternative actions are not completely known. So, the decision maker has to act in a sense on the spur of the moment. Whichever decision seems most practical in such a situation and comes most readily to the mind of the decision maker is the one that gets implemented. Examples of the third kind of RPD can be found in situations in the military context, the army and so on, in medical settings where suddenly a disease may be discovered or diagnosed and action has to be taken, in many business executive decisions, and in administration in general. Skill in decision making in such situations would definitely be influenced by what is commonly called presence of mind, because the prior rehearsal component is missing, and it is also influenced by experience with decision making in general.